In 1899, the era of outlaws is coming to an end. The United States is transforming into a land of law, and even the West has been largely tamed. Only a few gangs, like Dutch's gang, remain active, but they are being hunted down and wiped out. Cities and towns are now connected by transportation and communication, while corporations like Leviticus Cornwalls control the land and its wealth, hiring ruthless agencies like the Pinkertons to protect their interests. Dutch's gang attempted a robbery in Blackwater that ended in disaster. The Pinkertons ambushed them. Now the gang is on the run, heading north and taking refuge in the mountains, barely surviving thanks to a storm. With no resources and several members missing or dead, they reach the abandoned mining town of Coulter, where they find shelter, but they lack supplies. John Marston and Micah take on the task of searching for food. Dutch van der Linde leads the 24-member gang with Hosea as his advisor and right-hand man, and Arthur Morgan as his main enforcer, our protagonist. Arthur's life has been marked by tragedy, and looking into his past is key to understanding him as well as his relationship with Dutch and the gang. Arthur was born in 1863 to Lyle and Beatrice Morgan. His mother died when he was very young, and though he doesn't remember much about her, he keeps a picture of her by his tent decorated with flowers. Something she once told him brings good luck. His father, Lyle, was a known outlaw and is implied to have mistreated Arthur. In 1874, when Arthur was 11 years old, Lyle was arrested for robbery, and shortly after, Arthur witnessed his death, something he later said couldn't have come soon enough. Despite this, he still keeps a portrait of his father and his hat. The few belongings of his parents that Arthur still holds on to as an adult reflect how much he values family. Being orphaned left a deep emotional void in him, along with a strong need for belonging and connection. After spending 3 years surviving on the streets, he finally found what he was looking for. Dutch and Hosea took him in, becoming father figures to him. However, Arthur admits in his journal that in many ways he feels a deeper affection for Hosea. He sees him as someone kind, fair, and above all, genuinely human. Not long after, Dutch rescued John Marston, a 12-year-old orphan who soon became like a brother to Arthur. The two of them became Dutch's favorite sons, and for the first time, Arthur felt like he had found a family where he truly belonged. It's interesting to observe how Dutch recruits people. It almost seems like he has everything carefully calculated. When someone is going through a crisis or finds themselves emotionally vulnerable, their need for support, stability, and belonging skyrockets. In that state, the mind desperately seeks something to ease the distress. If at that moment someone appears offering protection, guidance, or a sense of purpose, it's highly likely that the vulnerable person will idealize that figure or group and develop a strong emotional attachment to them. Dutch understands this perfectly, and almost like a cult leader, identifies and recruits desperate people searching for meaning in a place where they feel safe. This is how he builds a gang that follows and obeys him without question. The loss of his parents left Arthur alone and deeply vulnerable. When he found a new family within the gang with Dutch and Hosea, he clung to them and adopted their ideals and teachings. Dutch constantly spoke about values like loyalty and responsibility to the gang, and these ideas became fundamental for Arthur, so much so that he was willing to die for them. At one point, Arthur even declares that the gang is the only real thing in his life and that he would kill and die for it. But Arthur's tragedies didn't end there. Years later, Arthur met Mary, whom he deeply loved and became engaged to. However, Mary's father disapproved of Arthur's criminal lifestyle, which led to their breakup. Mary asked him to leave that life behind so they could escape together. But out of loyalty to the gang and Dutch, Arthur refused. Mary eventually married another man who passed away before the events of the game. Later, Arthur had a relationship with Eliza, with whom he had a son named Isaac. Though Arthur couldn't promise much due to his way of life, he was committed to doing right by them. Every few months, he would visit, give them money and gifts, and spend a few days with them. However, one day, when he arrived at their home, he found 2 crosses outside. His family had been murdered by robbers for barely $10. This event scarred Arthur deeply. Each loss reignited the previous ones: the death of his parents, the end of his relationship with Mary, and now the loss of his son. The pain was so overwhelming that he chose to bury the memories and immerse himself even further in the outlaw life. After 20 years in the gang, Arthur had become Dutch's most trusted man, his right hand for any task that required intimidation or brute force. He was a formidable fighter, an unstoppable gunslinger, and above all, loyal. But now Arthur was about to go through a process that would make him question everything he had ever believed about Dutch, about the gang, and most importantly, about himself. Back in the present, Dutch and Arthur rode out to check on their search for supplies and came across Micah, one of the gang's more recent recruits, who had saved Dutch's life in a bar fight. Dutch and Micah had been the ones who planned the failed robbery on the Blackwater ferry. Dutch seemed very impressed with Micah, who was reckless, argumentative, and arrogant. Hosea and Arthur, however, didn't trust him. Micah informed them about a small farm that might have supplies, but when they arrived, they discovered it was occupied by members of the O'Driscolls, a rival gang with whom they had a deep-seated feud. After a gunfight in the cabin, they interrogated the last survivor, who revealed that Colum O'Driscoll, Dutch's longtime nemesis, was hiding nearby with his gang and planning to rob a train. While searching the cabin, they found Sadie Adler. The O'Driscolls had invaded her home, murdered her husband, and taken her hostage. Dutch decided to bring her into the gang. This group worked together to survive, each contributing in their own way. Susan Grimshaw kept kept order in the camp, Pearson handled food supplies, and Karen, Marybeth, and Tilly used their skills as thieves to gather information. Leopold Strauss managed the accounts and loan operations. Uncle and Reverend Swanson had their own usefulness, though they were more focused on their vices. Bill, Javier, Charles, and Lenny brought strength and skill with weapons. Meanwhile, John Marston, Arthur's adoptive brother, was lost in the storm, feared to be dead. John was another key figure in the story, and his journey was important in understanding Arthur. After being taken in by Dutch and growing up in the gang, John fell in love with Abigail, a former prostitute who had joined the group in 1894. Together, they had a son, Jack. However, John doubted that Jack was really his, which led him to abandon his role as a father and leave the gang for a year. This abandonment had a deep impact on Arthur. Considering his history of family losses, it's easy to see why. To him, what John did felt like a betrayal. Not only had he left behind the surrogate family that Arthur saw as sacred, but he had also abandoned his own real family. This likely struck a nerve in Arthur. On one hand, he could identify with Jack and relive the pain of losing his parents as a child. On the other, it might have reminded him of the loss of his own family later in life, fueling his resentment toward John. Arthur couldn't understand how someone could throw away something as valuable as family, something he had lost and cherished deeply. When John returned, most members of the gang welcomed him back. However, Arthur still felt betrayed, and it took him a long time to forgive him. In the present, Arthur and Javier set out to find John. Along the way, Arthur learns that Dutch killed a young girl for no reason during the Blackwater heist and says that's not the Dutch he knew. They find John injured and being stalked by wild animals, but manage to bring him safely back to Coulter. Dutch gathers the gang to scout a nearby O'Driscoll camp, claiming they need supplies, though Arthur and Hosea suspect he's really after revenge. Dutch and Cullum had once been allies, but became bitter enemies when Dutch killed Cullum's brother, and Cullum retaliated by murdering Annabelle, the woman Dutch loved. Arthur reminds him that he has always said revenge is a luxury they can't afford, but Dutch insists this isn't just about payback. It's a chance to get information on the O'Driscolls' planned train heist. Dutch's gang raids the camp, but Cullum has already escaped. They wipe out the O'Driscolls on site, take some dynamite, and uncover plans for the Cornwall train robbery. They also capture Kieran Duffy as a hostage, hoping he might prove useful. Wasting no time, Dutch decides to hit the train, successfully stealing valuable bonds. However, after the disaster in Blackwater and this new robbery, the gang has made even more enemies, this time within Cornwall's powerful corporation. As the snow begins to melt, the gang moves down to the plains. Dutch sends Lenny and Micah ahead to scout, and they eventually reach Horseshoe Overlook near the town of Valentine. The camp, with Dutch at its center alongside his often ignored girlfriend Molly O'Shea, becomes a new home. Meanwhile, Kieran remains a prisoner until they decide his fate. Dutch remembers that they need money, and every gang member contributes in some way. Strauss runs a loan business, and Arthur is responsible for collecting debts, while Hosea sells stolen wagons and Charles hunts for food. The women also provide valuable information. Mary Beth uncovers a train robbery opportunity, and Karen finds a lead on a potential bank heist. The strain of their efforts takes a toll, so the gang decides to take a break in Valentine. At a saloon, Bill starts a fight that quickly spirals out of control. Tommy, a local brute, steps in and takes on Javier, who struggles to keep up. Without hesitation, Bill asks Arthur to help. Arthur faces off against Tommy, but Tommy overpowers him, throwing him through a window before continuing the fight outside. After an intense brawl, Arthur gains the upper hand and nearly beats Tommy to death. Before things escalate further, a farmer and charity collector named Thomas Downs intervenes, stopping the fight. Later, Arthur goes hunting with Hosea, who reminisces about his late wife, Bessie. Arthur asks if he misses her, and Hosea replies every single day. Arthur then asks if he ever thought about leaving the outlaw life behind. Hosea admits he considered it, but it never lasted. Then, turning the question back, Hosea asks if Arthur has ever thought about leaving. Arthur immediately denies it. Hosea notes that if Dutch's plans work out and they make enough money, maybe they could all start fresh somewhere new. This conversation is significant because it gives us insight into what Arthur is feeling at this point in the story. With the government closing in and Dutch acting more erratic, Arthur begins questioning whether this outlaw life still makes sense. This internal crisis leads him to reflect on Mary and the life he left behind to follow the gang and his path as an outlaw. That's why, when Hosea remembers Bessie and says he misses her every day, Arthur asks if he ever thought about leaving this life. The truth is, even if Arthur won't admit it outright, he's thinking about Mary and projecting his own doubts and regrets about what could have been or could still be a different life. Later, Dutch interrogates Kieran, who reveals that Cullum O'Driscoll is hiding at 6 Point Cabin. Kieran leads them there. They wipe out several O'Driscolls, but Cullum is nowhere to be found. During the fight, Kieran saves Arthur's life, earning himself a place in the gang as a free man. Arthur has debts to collect. Deep down, this job disgusts and shames him. He knows that more often than not, these debts aren't owed by the wealthy, but by those already living in extreme poverty. People like Thomas Downs, a sick, desperate man with no money. Arthur confronts him at his ranch, and when Thomas can't pay, Arthur beats him mercilessly. During the beating, Thomas coughs up blood, which lands in Arthur's eye. Thomas collapses to the ground as his wife, Edith, rushes to him. His son, Archie, watches in horror, looking at Arthur as if he were the devil, and perhaps to him he is. Edith pleads with Arthur, explaining that Thomas is gravely terminally ill and begging for more time. But Arthur, unmoved, insists that they are not a charity and demands that they get the money before he walks away. Deep down, Arthur is disgusted by the incident and his own role in it. He reflects that perhaps what he did was wrong. Sometime later, Thomas dies, leaving Edith and Archie completely destitute. Debt collecting repulses Arthur, so why does he engage in acts that conflict with him so deeply on a moral level? One reason, without a doubt, is his strong sense of responsibility toward the camp. To Arthur, the gang is not just a group of outlaws, it is his family. There are 24 people in the camp who depend on everyone's contributions to survive, including women and children who have no means to fend for themselves. Arthur feels he must do his part, even if it means crossing lines that make him uncomfortable. In his mind, the survival of his people justifies the actions he takes. However, I don't think his justifications are solely based on his duty to the gang. When confronted about his actions, Arthur often shifts the blame to the world, saying things like, "This country is running wild, it ain't my fault the world is like this." These kinds of responses reveal a lot. Looking back at his history, it's easy to understand why Arthur might think this way. His life was marked by tragedies from an early age, likely leading him to believe that the world is inherently cruel. This belief may serve as a way to shield himself from pain, a means of depersonalizing suffering. If the world is harsh to everyone, then the tragedies he endured don't feel personal, but rather inevitable. This mindset could also serve as a way for Arthur to justify his actions. If the world is already merciless by nature, then what he does, no matter how terrible, is not an exception, but simply part of how things work. From this perspective, Arthur sees himself as just another cog in a much larger, ruthless system. Though deep down he knows many of his actions are morally questionable, he convinces himself that these people would have suffered anyway, whether at his hands or someone else's. Lenny returns to camp shaken. He and Micah had been missing after being sent on a scouting mission. Micah was arrested in Strawberry for murder, having killed a man in a drunken brawl. Arthur despises Micah and doesn't want to help him, but Dutch insists that despite his arrogance, he is a good man. Reluctantly, Arthur agrees and manages to free him. After the rescue, he tells Micah that he's lucky Dutch has his back, to which Micah responds that they are now family. Being Dutch's sons makes them brothers. Shortly after, Josiah Trelawney, a conman and occasional member of the gang, arrives with news about Sean McGuire, who was captured by bounty hunters after the failed Blackwater heist. With this information, the gang organizes a rescue mission while Sean is being transported. They successfully infiltrate and free him. A small victory for the gang, though they still have much work to do. Meanwhile, John Marston has almost fully recovered and returned to work. However, in the camp, his family is often neglected. At the same time, young Jack finds father figures among the gang members, especially Arthur, who even takes him fishing. Arthur thinks Jack is a good kid, a dreamer, a boy with a mother who loves him. He wonders if Jack will ever find what they are all searching for: peace and truth, far from all this madness and lies. After stealing assets, robbing trains, and sabotaging Cornwall's businesses, the gang has become a major target. As Arthur and Jack gather their belongings, agents Milton and Ross from the Pinkertons appear. Milton tells Arthur that he is a wanted man with a $5,000 bounty on his head, but that their real target is Dutch. If Arthur turns him in, Milton promises he won't have any trouble. Loyal as ever, Arthur refuses and returns to Dutch. When Arthur asks what they should do, Dutch simply replies that they should do nothing, just stay calm. Dutch doesn't seem too concerned, but Arthur begins to question the wisdom behind his indifference. For now, they are safe. Arthur meets up with John for a job stealing sheep and selling them in Valentine. As he does, he reflects that this life will soon come to an end. At this point, it's clear how much Arthur's doubts about his criminal life have grown, especially as he notices how Dutch continues to act in ways that contradict everything he has preached for years. For decades, Dutch built the gang's identity on an ethical code that supposedly set them apart from common criminals. He spoke of ideals: freedom, protecting the gang, resisting the government's control, and the grip of the wealthy elites. From his earliest days in the gang, Arthur believed in these ideals. During his first major heist in 1887, Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur not only stole gold from a bank, but distributed it among the city's most needy slums, orphanages, and shanty towns. That act was a statement of principles. They weren't just thieves, they were different. They stole from those who could afford it and helped the poor, abiding by certain ethical boundaries. Women and children were untouchable. Violence was a last resort, and vengeance was out of the question. This philosophy gave the gang a purpose, something beyond mere survival. But Dutch's recent actions suggest that all of it may have been just a facade. During the Blackwater heist, Dutch killed a young girl for no apparent reason, something that left Arthur stunned. It wasn't necessary or strategic. It was an impulsive act of brutality that clashed with everything Dutch had ever taught them. Since then, Dutch's decisions have seemed increasingly driven by vengeance and his own ego rather than the well-being of the gang. This contradiction strikes at the very core of Arthur's identity, and likely that of other gang members as well. Arthur had justified his life of crime by believing in Dutch's ideals and teachings. Everything he had done, the robberies, the violence, the suffering he had caused, made sense because he believed it served a greater purpose. But if those ideals were nothing more than empty words, and Dutch wasn't the man Arthur thought he was, then what was the point of of this criminal life. If the beliefs that held it together were just a facade, what remained? Worse still, did this mean Arthur had been nothing more than a bad man with no real purpose or justification for his actions? At one point, Arthur even writes in his journal, "My whole code, the thing that I have lived my life by and killed for, was it true? Or was there a greater lie that I was just too dumb to see?" After bringing the stolen sheep to Valentine, they meet Dutch and Strauss at the saloon. When John and Strauss step outside, Cornwall suddenly arrives, demanding the rest of them come out. Cornwall accuses the gang of repeatedly robbing him. He warns that he is not a man to be trifled with and orders his men to take care of them before leaving. Arthur frees his friends and the gang fights their way out of Valentine. They know they can't stay, so they decide to flee. They set up camp by a lake where Charles and Arthur help a German family that nearly gets themselves killed by accident. Arthur reflects that Charles is a better man than he is. He doesn't need to think about doing the right thing. It just comes naturally, as if it's the only way to be. The gang heads to Clemens Point near Rhodes, arriving in a region torn apart by a long-standing feud between two powerful families, the Greys and the Braithwaites. Dutch sees an opportunity and splits the group. Arthur will investigate the Greys while Hosea does the same with the Braithwaites. The Greys, wealthy tobacco plantation owners, control half the business in Rhodes. Lee Gray is the town's sheriff. The Braithwaites, former slave owners and cotton plantation aristocrats, now make their money through illegal liquor production dating back to the Civil War. The two families have been at odds for years. Dutch explains his plan to Arthur, earn both families' trust, rob them, and escape before they figure out the truth. Meanwhile, Sadie Adler, still grieving, feels trapped in the camp's domestic duties. Back at the Adler Ranch, she had been self-sufficient, sharing responsibilities with her late husband, even hunting alongside him. Now, feeling desperate, she wants to take on more dangerous jobs. Arthur decides to take Sadie with him to Rhodes, where they face an attack from a local gang but manage to fend them off. Sadie, driven by her hatred and thirst for revenge against the O'Driscolls, fights with a ferocity and bloodlust that unsettles even Arthur. She proves that she can fight just as well as any of the men in the gang. Arthur then returns to the home of Edith Downs, now a widow, to collect Thomas's debt. She tells him that she has almost paid everything off. Arthur responds that her husband knew the rules when he took the money and that he regrets how things ended, but insists that Thomas had a choice. He justifies himself by saying it's not his fault the world is the way it is. Edith counters that Thomas didn't have a choice, that he was a good man who helped others and that Arthur was the one who took him away. She tells Arthur not to deceive himself, that he was the one who truly had a choice. Finally, Edith hands over the money. This conversation is a turning point for Arthur's character. For years, he has believed that his life was beyond his control, that he had no choice but to follow the path Dutch had laid out for him. Dutch had instilled in him a worldview where absolute loyalty was paramount and anyone who questioned or opposed his authority was demonized. Disloyalty, whether real or perceived, was punished swiftly, leaving little room for gang members to think or act on their own. In this environment, Arthur convinced himself that there was no life outside the gang, that he couldn't survive on his own, and that his only option was to follow orders, even when they went against his own conscience. But Edith's words force him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He has always had a choice. No one forced him to obey Dutch. No one made him intimidate, steal, or hurt others. The conversation with Edith plants a seed in him that will continue to grow. If he has always had a choice, then maybe the future can be different. Maybe he can start making decisions that are truly his own. Dutch's plan with the Gray and Braithwaite families is set in motion. The gang helps the Grays confiscate illegal liquor from the Braithwaites, sells it back to them, and then distributes it at the Rhodes saloon to undercut their profits. They also steal the Braithwaites' horses and burn the Grays' tobacco fields, manipulating both sides while creating chaos. All of this is done in hopes of finding the supposed Confederate gold hidden somewhere between the two families. Despite being far from Valentine, the Pinkertons remain a looming threat. The gang learns that the O'Driscolls are seeking to negotiate a truce. Despite his deep hatred for Colum, Dutch agrees to meet, though everyone suspects a trap. Arthur takes position with his rifle, but their suspicions prove correct. Dutch and Micah escape unharmed, but Arthur is captured. The O'Driscolls plan to use Arthur as bait to lure Dutch and hand him over to the Pinkertons in exchange for their freedom. However, Arthur manages to escape, thwarting their plans. Back in Rhodes, the Grays and Braithwaites discover the gang's deception and decide to eliminate them. The Grays lure Arthur, Sean, Bill, and Micah into an ambush. Sean is killed instantly, though the Grays underestimate the gang's strength and are quickly eliminated. To Arthur, Sean was like an annoying little brother, but one he still cared for. As he remembers the good times they shared riding together, he realizes that everything is falling apart. Meanwhile, Catherine Braithwaite, enraged over the theft of her horses, kidnaps young Jack as revenge. The gang comes to the conclusion that the legendary gold supposedly dividing the two families is nothing more than a myth. Determined to get Jack back, the gang attacks the Braithwaites and learns that the boy has been handed over to Angelo Bronte in St. Denis. However, before they can go after him, the Pinkertons track Dutch down at what they thought was a safe camp. Agent Milton puts the gang's loyalty to the test by offering to take only Dutch and let the rest walk free. However, instead of surrendering, the gang draws their guns and the Pinkertons leave empty-handed. Now that their location has been compromised, the gang needs to move once again. They settle in Shady Belle as their new hideout. Molly tries to talk to Dutch, but he ignores her, saying he has far more important things to worry about. Dutch and Arthur ride to St. Denis. Along the way, Dutch admits that for a long time he believed they would find paradise somewhere in the West, but now he's not so sure. His new plan is to take the gang overseas, though not just yet. Before making any final decisions, they need money. Their goal in this progressive city is twofold: to gather enough money and to rescue Jack, John's son, who is being held by Angelo Bronte, a gangster who controls the city, including the law and the mayor. They track Bronte to his mansion. Bronte offers to return Jack in exchange for the gang completing a simple job for him. They comply, and Jack is safely returned. Arthur visits a church and meets Sister Calderon, who is teaching children to read. Their conversation is interrupted when one of the boys steals her crucifix. Arthur chases him down to retrieve it, but the sister asks him not to harm the boy. After recovering the crucifix, Arthur runs into Edith Downs, the widow of Thomas, the sick man he had beaten for failing to pay his debt. Now working as a prostitute in St. Denis to support her son, Edith confronts Arthur with shame and anger, accusing him of harassing her in front of an officer. With no choice, Arthur silently walks away. Later, he returns the crucifix to Sister Calderon, who thanks him deeply. She explains that it was a keepsake from her mother and calls him the most wonderful man. The contrast between Arthur's actions highlights his inner conflict. First, we see him performing acts that repulse him, intimidating people like Thomas Downs and collecting debts from the poorest and most desperate. He justifies these acts as part of his duty within the gang. But then we also see a completely different side of Arthur. He helped a German family that nearly died and recovered the sister's crucifix. Two completely selfless acts. These moments reveal the constant battle within Arthur between his cold, brutal side and his compassionate, noble one. This internal conflict is what makes him such a compelling character. On one side, he fulfills the expectations the gang has of him, playing the role of the tough and ruthless enforcer that Dutch needs. But at the same time, he can't help but show kindness and humanity when he encounters people in need. Later, Arthur receives a letter from Mary Linton, his former love, who is staying at a hotel in St. Denis. Arthur decides to visit her. The two are happy to see each other again. Mary asks if it's too late for them. Arthur admits that all he wants is to run away with her, but first he must take care of the gang. Once they are free and he has the money, they can finally be together. Mary promises to write. St. Denis is under the firm grip of Angelo Bronte, who controls the law and the government while scheming to manipulate Dutch's gang for his own benefit. He invites them to a high society ball hosted by the mayor as part of his plan. At the event, key figures who threaten the gang's way of life are present, including Hobart Crawley, a military official pushing for economic expansion across the United States and territories like Guarma, and Alberto Fusar, a Cuban overseeing Cornwall's sugar empire in Guarma while oppressing its people. Also present are representatives of the Wapiti tribe, pleading with the government to honor their treaty and prevent Cornwall from drilling for oil on their land. However, for now, the guests' agendas are not the gang's primary concern. They leave the event with critical information for future heists, a casino, a tram station, and most importantly, a bank. With a new plan in motion, the gang soon realizes that the Pinkertons aren't their only enemies. The O'Driscolls launch a surprise attack on their camp, forcing the gang to retreat to the house. Sadie is trapped outside, and when Arthur tries to help her, he witnesses the sheer rage and hatred she has built up against the O'Driscolls since they murdered her husband. Sadie had already seen herself as a capable outlaw, and after this moment, the gang sees it too. They manage to fight off the attackers, but lose another member, Kieran Duffy. Later, Sadie and Dutch witness Colum O'Driscoll's execution, but it does nothing to quell her anger. Dutch warns that if the O'Driscolls found their camp, the Pinkertons must not be far behind. He insists they need enough money to secure passage on a ship to Australia or Tahiti, and he mentions finding a captain willing to take them. They rob the casino and secure a decent haul, but it's not enough. Bronte, still pretending to be an ally, suggests robbing a train station, but it turns out to be a trap. St. Denis law enforcement is waiting for them. They escape on a tram, which ultimately crashes, leaving Dutch heavily concussed. Though he insists he's fine, Arthur notices a shift in him. Dutch, feeling humiliated by Bronte's manipulation, decides it's time to confront him. Hosea and Arthur question whether this is just about revenge, but Dutch insists that Bronte is the only thing standing in their way of robbing the bank and securing their escape. Hosea disagrees, arguing that there must be a simpler way. Dutch refuses to listen, declaring that there is no other choice. Hosea warns him that he's leading them all to ruin. The gang storms Bronte's mansion, kills his men, and Dutch brutally murders Bronte, tossing his body to the alligators while justifying it with, "It was him or us." Although Dutch always claimed he only killed those who deserved it, this time he acts like a mobster. Arthur, shaken, realizes that Dutch's actions are no longer simple mistakes. This is a profound shift in his mentor, one that is leading them all to ruin. Arthur has begun experiencing bouts of coughing. Hosea's plan to rob the bank is their last attempt at securing enough money to escape to Tahiti. Arthur doubts the plan will work, but Dutch accuses him of being closed-minded open-minded and tells him that if he prefers to see the family split up and go their separate ways, he should just say so. Arthur replies that's not what he wants. Dutch complains that Micah seems to be the only loyal one left. With no further discussion, the bank heist begins. Hosea and Abigail set up a distraction while the gang moves in, but the Pinkertons are waiting for them, holding Hosea hostage. Hosea, Dutch's longtime partner and the gang's voice of reason, is executed by Agent Milton. John is arrested. With Hosea dead and John captured, the rest flee across the rooftops, but Lenny is gunned down. The survivors take refuge in an abandoned building. St. Denis is locked down, and their only escape is by sea. Charles creates a diversion while the others hide aboard a ship bound for Cuba. However, a storm forces them off course, and they end up stranded on the island of Guarma, where they are captured by the overseer of the sugar plantation, one of Alberto Fusar's top men. Fusar and his men exploit the land and its people to fill Cornwall's ships and maximize profits. However, the local rebels are fighting back against this oppression, freeing their enslaved comrades as well as Dutch's captured men. In the chaos, Javier is wounded and taken prisoner. To escape the island and reunite with the rest of the gang, they must rescue Javier. The rebels know where he is, and in exchange for help with their cause, promise to get them a boat. Arthur joins Dutch for the mission. Since the failed Blackwater heist, Arthur has struggled to understand how Dutch could justify killing an innocent person for his own goals. Now he witnesses it firsthand. When a woman helping them asks for more money, Dutch kills her, claiming she was about to betray them. This wasn't a crime boss or an enemy. It was someone who had been helping them. Arthur, stunned, finally realizes that the man he once admired is gone. They free Javier, fight Fusar and his men, and escape the island, setting sail for Van Horn. There, they split up to regroup with the rest of the gang. Arthur tracks them down to Lakay with Dutch close behind. The Pinkertons are already waiting, but Arthur and Sadie flank them under heavy fire, forcing them to retreat. The remnants of the gang are back together, except for Molly, Dutch's girlfriend, and John, who remains imprisoned. Dutch begins to suspect that John may have betrayed them to the Pinkertons, but Sadie disagrees. Uncle finds Molly drunk, and upon bringing her to Dutch, she, tired of being ignored, claims she was the one who betrayed them. Dutch, furious, points his gun at her. Arthur tries to stop him, urging him not to pull the trigger, but Miss Grimshaw steps in first, shooting Molly and coldly stating, "She knew the rules, Arthur. What the hell is wrong with you?" At this moment, we can see a major shift in Arthur. He wanted them to let Molly go, even in the face of her supposed betrayal. Before, Arthur wouldn't have hesitated to follow the gang's rules, but now he's starting to embrace his compassionate, humane side. That night, Arthur goes to sleep and dreams of a young deer drinking from a lake, a reflection of the moral direction his life is taking. Arthur sets off for St. Denis to meet Sadie and attempt to free John, but he collapses along the way. His coughing fits have worsened. A doctor takes him in, and after an examination, Arthur is diagnosed with a terminal illness, tuberculosis, contracted weeks earlier from Thomas Downs, who had been dying when Arthur beat him for his unpaid debt. Upon leaving the doctor's office, Arthur sees a deer similar to the one in his dream, but as he tries to approach, it vanishes. It was just a hallucination. Knowing that his time is running out, Arthur begins to reflect on the kind of man he has been, the kind of man he is, and whether the world is filled with fury or love. He believes there is no good in him, yet he still sees goodness in people like Abigail and her love for Jack or Thomas Downs, who fought for the poor despite starving to death himself. When Arthur reunites with Dutch, he asks what the plan is now. They've been hunted everywhere. Where do they go next? Arthur is now focused on saving lives, especially those of the women in the gang. Dutch tells him he's starting to sound like Hosea. He admits that he doesn't have a final plan, but insists that all he needs is time and no traitors. Dutch demands loyalty from himself and from those he leads. In the past, he earned it with words that inspired love and devotion, but for some time now his actions have failed to reflect those words. Arthur goes to sleep and dreams of a young deer drinking from a lake. At dawn, he decides to leave with Sadie to rescue John without telling Dutch. He knows Dutch won't like it, but he feels the days of blind loyalty are over. He is still loyal, yes, but not blindly. Not until Dutch can see the disaster they are in and who their true friends really are. Sadie and Arthur successfully break John out of Sisika Penitentiary and bring him back to camp. Arthur reflects that he did it for Abigail, the most incredible woman he knows, but also for Jack and in part for John himself. Even though they have clashed for years, Arthur admits he cares about him. He believes John has stopped being as reckless as before and that maybe he has a chance at the kind of luck that always eluded Arthur. Jack is an innocent boy, and in him, Arthur sees everything he lost. Arthur had already begun questioning the life he had led, but his tuberculosis diagnosis is what truly shakes him to his core. His time is running out, and as he looks back with a clarity he never had before, now that the ideals and justifications have crumbled, he realizes that the balance of his actions does not favor him at all. He is not proud of who he has been. The weight of his choices has finally caught up to him. More than 20 years of a criminal life cannot be undone, and the time he has left seems insufficient to right all the wrongs he has done, but at the same time, the diagnosis sets him free. It gives him a new understanding of what truly matters and pushes him to finally act on the thoughts and emotions he has suppressed for so long. Edith Downs' words begin to make sense, and for the first time, Arthur makes a decision on his own. outside of Dutch's influence, he chooses to save John. This act marks a major shift in his priorities. His concern now is to help and save lives. Even if he doesn't feel it will be enough to redeem himself, at the very least, it is a way to make amends. Ironically, the same man who once collected debts from those who couldn't pay now feels crushed under a debt he believes can never be repaid. Abigail is overjoyed at John's return, but Dutch does not share her happiness. He is furious that they saved John instead of following his plan. Later, Arthur learns that Dutch and Micah have gone to Ansburg to confront Cornwall. Arthur follows them. When they reunite, Micah insists there must be a rat among them, but Arthur believes they have simply been getting careless. Arthur suggests they leave Cornwall alone since they need money, not vengeance. However, Dutch insists it's just a social visit. He plans to negotiate and convince Cornwall to call off the Pinkertons. On the dock, as Cornwall's ship arrives, Dutch and his men emerge from hiding. Dutch demands a ship, $10,000, and safe passage in exchange for Cornwall's life, but Cornwall refuses and Dutch kills him. As Arthur processes his new perspective on the world, he crosses paths with Mrs. Downes, who tells him to stay away. He apologizes and says that this country and its men have spiraled out of control, that it's no more his fault than anyone else's. But she replies with a truth that cuts through his excuses. Rather than spreading chaos, he should try to spread kindness. Arthur wonders how when the only thing he knows is how to fight. When he asks about her son, she tells him he is working in the mines until the conditions destroy his health, which won't take long. Arthur considers stepping in, but she insists he leave them alone and find another fight. This encounter teaches Arthur another vital lesson. As I mentioned before, he has believed that his actions were inevitable, simply a response to the ruthless world around him. Thinking that way was easier because it allowed him to justify the harm he caused and avoid confronting his guilt. In his mind, he was only doing what was necessary to survive, following the rules of a cruel world, but Mrs. Downes's words challenged that belief. As she told him, Arthur always had a choice, and this moment is a reminder that choices truly matter. Even if the world is harsh and full of injustice, that doesn't mean people have to add to the chaos. Each of us decides what we contribute to the world. More chaos or more kindness. This encounter leaves a deep mark on Arthur, who now begins to seek ways to spread kindness. Arthur goes to the mine looking for Archie, Edith's son, and finds him being harassed by men mocking his mother's work. Arthur intervenes and takes a punch from one of them, but knocks the man down in a single hit and manages to free Archie. Archie, worried, says things will only get worse now, but Arthur tells him he has money he can give them to start a new life. He urges Archie to talk to his mother and consider it. Arthur receives another order from Strauss to collect a debt. When he tracks down the debtor, the foreman informs him that the man has died and tells him to speak with his widow. Arthur finds her with her son, and she explains that they have nothing left to pay him, asking if he wants her son's shoes, the little food they have, or for her to sleep with him. She tells him that her husband worked himself to death trying to repay his debts, and now they are about to lose their home. Arthur, moved, decides to forgive the debt. She thanks him but also condemns both him and Strauss for what they do to people. Arthur returns to camp and confronts Strauss. He drags him into his tent and tells him he won't kill him even though he should. Then he throws the ledger to the ground and banishes Strauss from the camp, telling him to find honest work. Later, Arthur returns to Edith Downes' house to see if she accepted the money, but she refuses. She tells him to let go of his guilt and says the only thing he can do now is decide what kind of man he wants to be with the time he has left. Arthur agrees and insists on giving her the money so they can start over. He admits that he ruined his life and suffers for it every day, but he begs her not to let pride destroy them. Finally, she accepts the money and thanks him. Arthur reflects that Edith saw him for what he is, a killer looking for redemption. But he doesn't believe he is redeemable. He doesn't want to save himself because he doesn't think he deserves it. He just wants to help some people. Throughout the story, Arthur has proven that he is not just a hardened criminal. We have seen several moments where his humanity and kindness shine through. What's interesting, however, is that Arthur doesn't allow himself to acknowledge that side of himself. Perhaps because with the clarity that comes from facing the end of his life, he's painfully aware of the harm he has caused and that guilt torments him. In his mind, he feels that it is too late to change. He is convinced that no matter how many good things he tries to do now, he will die as a bad man. But what happens next will change Arthur's perspective completely. Arthur visits Sister Calderon and tells her about his illness. He confesses that he feels he has lived a bad life. The sister responds that everyone has lived bad lives, that we all sin, but that Arthur's problem is that he doesn't know himself. She explains that every time she has seen him, he has been helping others and smiling. Arthur recalls the losses he has suffered since childhood, and the sister tells him that life is full of pain, but also of love and beauty. When Arthur asks what he should do now, she tells him to be grateful because for the first time, he can see his life clearly. She suggests that he help someone because that makes him happy. Arthur sincerely admits that he is afraid. The sister listens and tells him there is nothing to fear. She encourages him to bet on love and to perform an act of kindness. Her words ease the fear Arthur had been feeling and make him realize that maybe he still has something worth fighting for. Arthur commits himself to trying. This scene is beautiful and, in my opinion, represents the emotional climax of the story. That's why I want to take a moment to reflect on a few things. First, this scene shows us a side of Arthur that we rarely see, a vulnerable and completely sincere man. Arthur has always been the kind of man who projects strength as if nothing ever phases him. He is the type of person who keeps his emotions bottled up because he believes showing weakness is not an option. But as players, we know that his reality is much more complicated. We know what Arthur has been through and what he is facing. We understand him because we have read his journal, seen his most intimate thoughts, and felt the weight of everything he has endured. That's why this scene is so impactful. For the first time, we see Arthur remove his mask. The moment he admits he is afraid is incredibly powerful, and we feel the weight of his words. Not just because we understand how difficult it is for him to say it, but because in some way many of us see ourselves reflected in him. Many men have been in that position, pretending to be fine, projecting an image of strength while inside they are broken or consumed by fear. Arthur embodies that internal struggle so many face, the mistaken belief that being strong means never showing weakness, that admitting fear is a failure. But in this scene, Arthur teaches us that there is no shame in vulnerability, in acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and in allowing others to help carry the weight. Seeing Arthur, a man who has endured so much throughout his life, finally admit that he is afraid is cathartic, because in his vulnerability, he gives us permission to explore our own. On the other hand, by this point, Arthur had already received several messages that had deeply affected him, like Edith Downes' words. However, one fear still remained, the fear of dying without having found redemption. What's interesting, and probably not coincidental, is that the relief he seeks comes through Sister Calderon. On a symbolic level, she represents a connection to the divine. In his current situation, Arthur is grappling with profound spiritual doubts. Perhaps on some unconscious level, he was more open to hearing what Sister Calderon had to say, as if in that moment he was facing God through her words. What Sister Calderon tells Arthur is phenomenal. She reassures him that she knows him, that every time she has seen him, he has been helping others and smiling. She shows him that being good or bad isn't something determined in the abstract or by what one thinks of themselves, but by the impact their actions have on the lives of others. It's true that Arthur has caused pain and suffering to many people for the wrong reasons, but the sister tries to make him see something else, that within him there is also a compassionate and kind side, one that has surfaced more than once. Perhaps the opportunity for redemption, for Arthur, and for any of us comes when we are able to see our lives with clarity, because once we become aware of our mistakes, of what is right and of what we must do, not changing becomes a conscious choice. This is the fundamental shift for Arthur. Until that moment, he had thought of redemption as a balance sheet of good and bad actions at the end of one's life, determining whether the final score was positive or negative, and if it really worked that way, he would never have enough time to make up for everything he had done. This idea led him to believe that someone like him couldn't be redeemed. Besides, if redemption worked that way, how would it be measured and who decides the rules? Is it one good act for every bad one, or do some actions carry more weight than others? Arthur starts to realize that it doesn't work like that. True redemption isn't about numbers or transactions. It happens when you choose to do what is right simply because it is right, without expecting anything in return, without seeking absolution. It is never too late to live that way, no matter how far we've fallen. As human beings, we have the ability to change. We are not condemned to follow a fixed path determined by our past mistakes. We are possibility. Our essence is not carved in stone, it is dynamic, always in motion. Each present moment is a new opportunity to decide who we want to be and what we want to do with our lives. If we have made mistakes, if we have failed ourselves, as long as we are alive, there is room to change, to repair, to grow. And that includes finding redemption, not because someone grants it to us, but because we choose to live in a way that reflects the best of who we are. That is Arthur's transformation. To stop worrying about making up for his past and start focusing on what he can do here and now. And in that shift, he will find something he has been searching for his entire life: peace. Arthur dreams once again of the stag by the lake. Another day, Arthur confides in Charles about his illness, and Charles tells him that in a way he's lucky. Any day could be their last. They could die that very night. In a way, knowing gives him a gift. He still has time to make things right. The others, Hosea, Lenny, Sean, never got that chance. Arthur has the opportunity to do something better. After killing Cornwall, a man more powerful than the government, the gang now has not only the Pinkertons after them, but also the full force of the law and the military. To buy some time, they destroy the bridge, delaying the army. However, the gang is now following different objectives with an irreparable divide among them. John confesses he's been uneasy, thinking a lot about prison and how he no longer recognizes Dutch. He believes Dutch now enjoys killing in cold blood, seeking revenge, and causing more chaos. He also feels that this escape plan isn't right. Arthur feels the same. John admits he loves Dutch and is grateful that he saved him years ago, but he wishes he had done more for him when he was arrested. Arthur tells him he should escape with his wife and son. John asks about loyalty, and Arthur tells him to be loyal to what really matters. John asks what Arthur will do, and Arthur, coughing, tells him he'll be fine and asks him to do it for him, because that would bring him peace. Arthur receives a letter from Mary Linton. She tells him she misses him and always will, but that his world feels like a trap he can't escape, and she can't live that way. She writes that there is a good man inside him, but he is fighting against a giant that wins over and over again. Finally, she says goodbye forever. Arthur wonders what he expected. They were never meant to be, and they never really were. And yet, in the end, he discovered he had a heart because it was broken. He feels sad and confused, torn between different ideas of who he was, and realizes he was none of them. Later, Charles and Arthur do everything they can to help the Wapiti tribe and their chief Rains fall. He explains that although peace treaties were made, the army broke them. They've been displaced and punished repeatedly. Now the army seeks to provoke the natives and destroy the agreement, allowing Cornwall's empire to drill for oil on their land. Dutch notices the impulsive nature of Eagle Fly's, Rains Fall's son. Eagle sums it up clearly. Colonel Favors is a liar and a murderer, and they won't stop until they wipe out the entire tribe. Dutch pushes Eagle Flies to attack the oil refinery, believing that a conflict between the army and the natives will be the distraction they need to steal and escape. Before the raid, Arthur dreams again of the stag by the lake, slowly turning its head toward him. The day of the attack arrives. The gang rides with the natives. With Eagle Flies in danger, they fight to protect him, but the army arrives with heavy artillery. Arthur and Dutch manage to enter the refinery to retrieve the bonds, but the army blocks their escape. Arthur falls through a broken pipe and is ambushed by soldiers. Dutch, though he could help, decides to abandon him. Eagle Flies saves him, but is wounded by Colonel Favors. Arthur immediately takes him down. Arthur confronts Dutch for leaving him behind, but Dutch denies it. Together with Charles, they take Eagle Flies back to his father. On the way, Charles points out that Dutch has become the kind of man he always said they should never be. Arthur responds that maybe he always was, and remembers that there were once lines they wouldn't cross, even times when they helped others, but those lines disappeared long ago. Charles believes it's time they draw their own lines. When they return Eagle Flies to his father, he dies. Arthur returns to the camp, now a shadow of what it once was. By this point, many members of the gang have already left. Uncle, Mary Beth, Karen, Reverend Swanson, and the camp's cook, Pearson. Dutch is lost. It's unclear whether he changed or simply revealed who he truly was. For years, Hosea, his best friend, was his moral compass. But with his absence and Micah's influence, Dutch now follows the advice of someone who feeds his ego and fuels chaos. Micah is pushing him to become the man he used to be, the kind who kills innocents, prioritizes revenge, and leaves the weak behind. With his illness worsening and the world closing in on them, Arthur wants to protect those he cares about most. He agrees to help Dutch with one final heist, but insists that once it's done, they let the women and children go. Though irritated, Dutch agrees. The gang boards the train for their last job. During the robbery, John is shot. Dutch and Micah promise to go back for him, while the rest blow up the train car and secure the fortune they had always dreamed of. When Arthur asks about John, Micah coldly replies that the patrol killed him and they had to flee. Tilly, carrying Jack in her arms, finds the gang and tells them that the Pinkertons have captured Abigail. Micah, indifferent, shrugs it off, saying she's just a girl. Dutch, without hesitation, agrees. He apologizes to Arthur before ordering everyone to move on, as if Abigail wasn't worth the trouble. Arthur, however, kneels in front of Jack and promises him that he will bring his mother back. Alongside Sadie, he rides to Van Horn, where they fight to free Abigail. In the chaos, Sadie is captured. Arthur presses forward and confronts Milton, who, before attempting to kill him, reveals a devastating truth. Micah has been feeding information to the Pinkertons since they captured him and offered him a deal. He also confesses that Molly never talked, despite all the pressure they put on her. Before Milton can do any more harm, Abigail appears and kills him. Together, Sadie, Abigail, and Arthur flee on horseback, fighting off the Pinkertons. Exhausted and with his illness worsening, Arthur urges them to stop. He tells Abigail that everyone believes John is dead, but assures her that John loved her and Jack. He begs them to find Jack and leave, while he returns to camp to try and free Dutch from Micah's influence. When he arrives, Arthur confronts Micah, accusing him of being the rat. Micah, of course, denies it. The tension is unbearable. The two men draw their guns, aiming at each other while the gang watches. Micah serves as Arthur's ultimate foil. Though both are criminals and part of the same gang, they represent completely opposite sides of the spectrum. Arthur doesn't act out of pleasure or malice. His actions are driven by loyalty, necessity, or even a misguided idea of what it means to do the right thing. His crimes weigh on him, and throughout the story, we've witnessed his inner struggle. Micah, on the other hand, is pure evil, a vile, ruthless man who only looks out for himself. He betrays and manipulates without remorse, reveling in the chaos he creates. This contrast is deliberate. Through Micah, we understand that Arthur, despite everything, retains his humanity. Despite his mistakes and the terrible things he's done, there is a morality in him that sets him apart from someone like Micah. At that moment, John appears alive and furious. He confronts Dutch for abandoning him, and Arthur, without hesitation, demands that everyone choose a side. This is the end. Miss Grimshaw arrives and aims her gun at Micah, but before she can fire, Javier interrupts, warning that the Pinkertons are closing in. Micah seizes the distraction and guns Grimshaw down. Dutch, gun in hand, watches everything unfold in silence. His gaze shifts between Arthur, John, and Micah. He says nothing, but the question is clear. Who is truly on his side and who has betrayed him? Arthur and John stand alone. Only John stands with Arthur. The rest of the gang follows Dutch. The two sides face off, guns raised, ready to fire. But in a telling moment, Javier, despite being on Dutch's side, subtly points his gun upward, unwilling to pull the trigger. The Pinkertons storm in, demanding they drop their weapons. In the chaos, the gang flees, leaving Arthur and John behind, alone against the world. Arthur knows his time is running out, but if he can accomplish one last thing before the end, if he can reunite a family and give John the chance to start anew, then his life will have meant something. Not long ago, Arthur had reflected on how he saw in Jack the things he himself had lost. Maybe John could have the luck that always eluded him. In John, Arthur sees a reflection of himself, a man with a similar past, but one who still has a chance at redemption and an honest life with his family, a life Arthur had always valued but lost long ago. Now, with the little time he has left, he realizes that path is no longer his to take, and in that realization, he finds the act of love that Sister Calderon had urged him to make, saving John so he can have the life Arthur never could. It's his way of making amends for the pain of failing to save his own son, Isaac, and Eliza. By saving John, he is also saving Abigail and Jack. The two escape through the caves and flee into the mountains, but they are surrounded. Dutch and Micah pursue them while the Pinkertons wait ahead. As they race through the chaos, a bullet strikes Arthur's horse. He crashes to the ground, hard, and is forced to continue on foot. With enemies closing in from all sides, he draws his revolver and makes his last stand. John urges him to keep running, to escape together, but Arthur knows that not both of them will make it. He makes the choice to stay behind so John can have a chance to reunite with his family. John hesitates, but Arthur convinces him. Before leaving, John looks at him, his eyes filled with gratitude, and says, "You're my brother." Arthur smiles with the last bit of strength he has left and responds, "I know." With those words, John runs. Arthur, armed, fires at the Pinkertons, covering his brother's escape. But then he is ambushed by Micah. The two fight with the fury of men who have waited for this moment for far too long. It's brutal. Punches, cuts, blood, and the weight of every betrayal carved into their exhausted bodies. Finally, they collapse to the ground, gasping for air, barely able to move. Arthur crawls toward his gun, but Micah scoffs at him. "You won't make it," he sneers, that familiar smug grin stretching across his face. "You already lost." Arthur, with a final spark of defiance, corrects him. "No, turns out I won." Just as his fingers brush against his revolver, Dutch appears. He steps over the gun, blocking Arthur from reaching it. His voice is eerily calm when he says, "It's over." Arthur looks up at him. He should hate him. He should despise him for everything he has done. But he can't. Dutch was like a father to him, the man who took him in when he had nothing, who taught him everything he knows. And even now, even as that man has become a shadow of what he once was, Arthur cannot turn his back on him. He was loyal to the very end. With his last breath, Arthur reminds Dutch of what deep down he already knows. Micah is the rat. Micah, ever the manipulator, tries to sway Dutch with more promises of escape. But for once, Dutch is silent. Before he can respond, the sound of the approaching Pinkertons fills the air. Arthur looks at him one last time and with a voice weak but full of truth tells him, "I gave you everything I had." Dutch, unable to meet his gaze, says nothing. Micah, desperate, insists that they can still escape. But Dutch, for the first time in a long time, doesn't follow him. He doesn't speak. He just turns and walks away, leaving behind his right-hand man, his adoptive son, the one who remained loyal to him until the very end. Micah curses in frustration and storms off in the opposite direction. Arthur, exhausted, drags himself forward with the last of his strength. He knows this is the end, but there is no fear. He presses his hands against the earth beneath him, feeling its weight, its solidity, and with one final effort, he lifts his face toward the rising sun. And then he sees it. The deer. The same one that appeared in his dreams. The one that guided him when he was lost. The sacred creature that, in many cultures, represents purity and sacrifice. Slowly, the deer turns its head toward Arthur as if acknowledging him. And with that image in his eyes, Arthur exhales his last breath. Arthur bet on love, and he won. That good man inside of him, the one who had so often been defeated by the giant of his circumstances and his mistakes, finally triumphed. In his final moments, he became the man that Mary and Sister Calderon had always believed he could be. He found the redemption he never thought possible, and he did it on his own terms. Arthur went from being a ruthless debt collector to becoming a debtor himself, a man who felt he owed too much to life and to others. But in the end, he found a way to settle his debt, not by tallying up good deeds in hopes of balancing his past, but through a single act of pure love. And not just any act of love, the greatest one of all, giving his life for others. The last thing Arthur sees before he dies is deeply symbolic. In the mythology of some Native American tribes, the deer is considered sacred because it was believed to offer itself willingly to be hunted, ensuring the survival of the people. That is exactly what Arthur did. Like the deer, he sacrificed himself for the well-being of others. And in that final sunrise, he found the peace he could never grasp in life. Not only did he save John and his family, but in doing so, he saved himself.